Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a quiet room, or somewhere where the rain gently touches your window? Wherever you are, take a deep breath. Let the world fade for a while. Tonight, I will take you back to a land once bound in chains, where the whispers of the enslaved carried through sugarcane fields and the cry for freedom rose higher than the mountains of Saint-Domingue. This is the story of Haiti, a story not only of pain and fire, but of courage, of souls who refuse to remain silent beneath the weight of tyranny. So close your eyes and listen, as I speak of those who turned chains into symbols of freedom. I remember the hush of twilight on the plantation, when the sky turned a gentle purple and the heat of the day finally began to soften. In those moments between daylight and darkness, a quiet would fall over the sugarcane fields of Saint-Domingue. The cane stalks, taller than a man, would rustle softly in the evening breeze coming off the distant sea. Crickets began their nightly chorus, and the sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine drifted through the humid air. It was beautiful, achingly beautiful, as if the island itself were singing a lullaby. Yet beneath that beauty lay so much pain. By day I toiled like all the others, under a blazing sun that turned our sweat to salt on our skin. I was born into bondage on this Caribbean island that some called the Pearl of the Antilles for its richness. But for us enslaved people, it was a land of unending sorrow and yearning. My name is Toussaint, and as a child I learned early that every rose in these green hills grew from the blood and tears of my people. I saw the overseer's whip lash out like a snake's tongue, saw strong men and women bent low cutting cane until their hands bled, saw mothers cradle babies born into slavery, knowing no hope for their future. And yet, even in those darkest moments, something in our spirit refused to be broken. In the evenings after the day's punishments and ordeals, when the plantation's great house glowed with candlelight and the laughter of our oppressors, we gathered in our humble huts and shared whispers of freedom as softly as prayers. My father was an African, a man taken from the kingdom of Alada, they say, a place across the great ocean. He was proud and taught me that though our bodies were enslaved, our souls belonged only to God and to our ancestors. As a boy, I would sit at his feet by the small fire behind our quarters, watching the flames dance in his dark eyes as he spoke of faraway homelands and noble ancestors. He told me that in our veins ran the blood of warriors and maybe even kings, though here we were treated lower than beasts. I remember his calloused hand resting on my shoulder as he said, "Toussaint, freedom lives in here," and he tapped my chest above my heart. I held those words deep inside me. The plantation where I grew up was called Breda, nestled near the northern coast of Saint-Domingue. It was a sprawling estate, with fields of sugarcane that rippled like a green sea under the sun, and groves of banana and mango trees at the edges where we snatched what fruit we could to ease our hunger. Beyond the fields, blue mountains rose, cloaked in mist and lush forests. I often gazed at those mountains, wondering if the spirits of marooned slaves lived there in freedom, in the wild places where no chains could reach. It comforted me to imagine that beyond those peaks lay liberty, as boundless as the sky. When I was still young, an old woman on the plantation named Nana would tell us children's stories in the Creole tongue at night. We would huddle together on mats on the earthen floor of her hut, while outside the tropical night thrummed with cicadas and distant drum beats. Nana's eyes were milky with age, but her voice was strong as she sang of Ogun, the warrior spirit, and Erzuli, the mother of love. She told us of brave souls who fought against captivity. One story that tingled my spine was of Makandal, a maroon leader from years before I was born. Nana said Makandal had only one arm, but many disguises, and he used the island's own plants to make poisons that struck fear into the slave masters. The French burned him at the stake when they finally caught him. But as the flames rose, Makandal laughed and promised he would never die. Legend said when the fire was at its fiercest, he vanished, transforming into a black mosquito that buzzed away into the night. The masters showed a pile of ashes to the crowd, but we children always believed Makandal escaped to continue his fight in secret. We believed his spirit flew in the mosquitoes that swarmed the swamps at dusk, waiting for the right moment to return. Such tales lit a spark in my young heart. The idea that one of us could defy the mighty French and live on. As I grew older, I was fortunate in one regard. My enslavement was less brutal than some. The owners of Breda allowed me certain freedoms. Perhaps they saw I was small in stature. They nicknamed me Fatras Bâton, sickly stick, because I was so thin and frail as a child. And they did not send me to chop cane under the overseer's lash. Instead, I was taught to handle horses and oxen. I became a coachman, driving the carriages and wagons, and a stable hand tending the livestock. In time, I learned the healing arts, using herbs to treat sick animals and people alike. Some nights I crept into the dark forest to gather medicinal leaves and roots, guided by knowledge passed down from Africa. An old Jesuit priest, before his order was expelled from the colony, had taught me my letters and prayers when I was a boy. By the dim light of an oil lamp, I traced the shapes of French letters on parchment and mouthed Latin hymns. The priest and my godfather, Pierre Baptiste, encouraged me to read the Holy Scriptures and whatever books they had. Through them, I tasted ideas far beyond the plantation. Ideas about justice, about every human being having a soul and rights given by God. In secret, I also listened to the whispered discussions of the free people of color who sometimes visited Breda. These were mulatto or black people who had bought or earned their freedom. They spoke of news from France, where a great revolution was stirring. Words like liberté, égalité, liberty and equality, drifted through the air like tantalizing perfumes. I learned that in 1789, across the ocean, common people had risen up against their king, declaring that all men were born free and equal in rights. At night in my cramped quarters, with tropical rain pattering on the thatch roof, I would whisper those words. All men are born free, equal in rights. It felt like a prayer and a prophecy. Could it ever be true here, where men and women were bought and sold like cattle? The years passed quietly in appearance, but underneath, the island was a volcano, and I could feel it rumbling. By my middle years, I was nearly 50 by 1791. I had gained an odd position. I was no longer a slave in chains. My master had granted me manumission some years earlier. I owned a small piece of land and even oversaw a portion of the Breda plantation on behalf of my former master, who trusted me. I had a wife, Suzanne, and children whom I cherished. In outward life, I had reason to want peace. But in my heart, I was restless. I saw that most of my people were still in bondage. I managed my master's plantation efficiently and treated the workers more kindly than others did. But they were still not free. At night, I still heard the drums in the distant hills where enslaved Africans held voodoo ceremonies, calling on the Loa spirits for strength. I attended Mass dutifully each Sunday and prayed to the merciful Christian God for deliverance of our people. By candlelight, I had read the words of philosophers, the writings of men like Rousseau and Locke, who spoke of the natural rights of man. These ideas and my faith together formed a certainty in me. Slavery was a sin against God and nature. How long could such a cruel system stand when even the very soil seemed soaked in innocent blood? The slaves on Saint-Domingue vastly outnumbered the whites. 500,000 Africans laboring under the whip, and only a tiny fraction of that number were the plantation owners and their families. It was as if a great many leaf-cutter ants carried huge loads for a few idle butterflies. An unnatural imbalance. And like ants, we communicated in ways unseen. Through networks of whispers passed from plantation to plantation by peddlers, by maroons, those who had escaped to the mountains, and by the songs we sang in the fields. There was a song I often heard the field hands sing in Creole under their breath. At first it sounded like a nonsense lullaby, but I came to realize it carried a hidden message of rebellion, naming plantation names and a date when something would happen. The realization made my heart pound. It meant the slaves were organizing, planning something big. A spark of both hope and fear lit within me. In the summer of 1791, the air itself felt tense. The masters were anxious. There had been an uprising by some free men of color demanding their rights a year before, led by a man named Joux. The colonists had captured and executed him with horrific cruelty, breaking his bones alive on the wheel. I heard about it in horrified whispers. If they would do that to a free mulatto gentleman for merely asking equality with whites, what would they do if the enslaved blacks rose up for freedom? The planters boasted that slaves would never dare. But in the quarters and secret glades, I sensed courage growing. In August, a thick unease settled over the northern plain. I remember a hush in the evenings. Even the insects seemed to quiet, as if nature herself was holding her breath. I found myself praying more intensely, as if bracing for a storm. One hot evening, as I walked by the slave quarters after returning from a day's work, I saw a small gathering of the field hands. They were huddled behind a hut, speaking in low tones. An older man named Georges, whom I knew to be a Hungan, a Vodou priest, caught my eye. He gave a subtle nod, a signal to trust what was coming. "Bide your time, Toussaint," he murmured as I passed. "Grand métaphysique la apvini." The Great Spirit is coming. I did not fully grasp his meaning, but I felt a chill despite the warm, sticky air. That night, I could not sleep. I sat outside my cottage under the canopy of brilliant stars. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a gauzy ribbon of hope. I thought of Makandal's star, of Ogé's broken body, of my own children sleeping safely for now, and of all those still in chains. I silently pleaded with God to show me the path of righteousness. As the night deepened, clouds gathered over the mountains. In the distance, a faint roll of thunder sounded. I closed my eyes and listened, hearing not just thunder, but the echo of drums. Or was it my heart? The breeze picked up, carrying the faint scent of smoke or incense. And perhaps it was only my imagination, but I thought I heard voices on that wind. soft chanting in a language older than France, older than the colony, the voices of the ancestors calling from these distant stars. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I saw visions. The old African kings my father spoke of, standing proud, the Virgin Mary, her mantle around the oppressed, the warrior spirits sharpening their swords. A storm was coming, not just the one building in the sky that August night, but a storm in the soul of my people. I opened my eyes to see a flash of distant lightning silhouette the palm trees. The night birds fell silent. I felt a quiet knowing settle over me. Change was on the wind. Freedom, that long-denied dream, was stirring, like a child about to be born. And I, quietly, tremulously, welcomed it, even as I feared the pain it might bring. I breathed a prayer into the heavy air. Lord, if it be your will, let our suffering end, and use me as you will. In the stillness that followed, I felt at once as small as a single drop of rain, and yet part of something vast as the ocean. The island held its breath, and so did I. In that pregnant pause of history, the seeds of revolution were beginning to crack open beneath the soil. And soon, very soon, the first shoots of freedom would break through, reaching for the light. The storm broke on a moonless night in August 1791. In a clearing deep within the Bois Caïman, an alligator-infested swampland outside Le Cap, slaves from dozens of plantations gathered in secret. Though I was not there in person, the accounts of that night came to me later in whispered reverence. And it lives in my mind as if I had stood among them, shoulder to shoulder. I picture a host of my people under the cover of towering trees, their skin gleaming with rain and sweat, faces lifted in determined ecstasy. Warm rain was pouring down in sheets, drenching everyone and turning the ground to mud. Lightning clawed across the sky, illuminating hundreds of strong, dark faces for brief instants at a time. Through the darkness, the steady pulse of drums, handmade drums carried in secret, beat like the very heartbeat of Africa. At the center of the gathering stood a man named Coachman, a hulking figure with eyes alight in feverish conviction. He was a Maroon and a Vodou priest, a leader respected among the enslaved. Beside him was a woman, Cécile Fatiman, a Mambo priestess whose white dress clung to her as the rain plastered it to her skin. She held a black pig by a rope, a powerful sacrifice in our African tradition. The drums intensified, thunder boomed as if echoing them, and Cecile's voice rang out in a chant that cut through the night. Many later said that Aloha, a spirit, possessed her in that moment. With a flash of lightning, Cécile Fatiman drew a knife across the pig's throat, sacrificing it to the spirits. The pig's blood steamed in the rain and was collected in a wooden bowl. As the thunder rumbled overhead, she passed that bowl around. One by one, the men and women dipped their fingers or pieces of white cloth into the warm blood and marked their foreheads, sealing a sacred pact. In the hush that followed, Coachman raised his arms to the tempestuous sky. His deep voice carried over the rain and drumbeat. Those who were there recall fragments of his prayer, words that have since become legend. He cried out, "The God who created the earth, who created the sun that gives us light, the God who holds up the ocean, who makes the thunder roar, our God who has ears to hear. You who are hidden in the clouds, who watch us from where you are. You see all that the whites have made us suffer. The white man's God calls him to commit crimes. But our God, who is so good, so just, He orders us to revenge our wrongs. It's He who will direct our arms and bring us victory. It's He who will assist us. We all should throw away the image of the white men's God who is so pitiless. Listen to the voice of liberty that speaks in all our hearts. As one voice, the crowd roared in agreement. Some say a great serpent spirit slithered through the grass at Boukman's feet. Others swear the fierce Lo Azili Dantor, the mother protector, was present in the form of the wild wind that night. Under that howling wind and rain, every person present swore a solemn oath to fight for freedom, to never be slaves again. They pledged unity, that they would rather die than live one more day under the chain. It was an oath sealed in blood and storm, and the spirits seemed to answer. A bolt of lightning struck a tree at the edge of the clearing, splitting it aflame even in the downpour. The sudden fire illuminated Boukman's face, contorted with passionate wrath and hope. Liberté ou la mort, freedom or death, the people shouted. The revolution was born in that moment, baptized by blood and thunder. In the days that followed, the northern plain of Saint-Domingue was set ablaze. Literally, flames consumed plantation after plantation as the enslaved took up whatever arms they could find. Machetes, sharpened hoes, a few stolen muskets. I remember waking in the middle of one night to a distant orange glow on the horizon. The scent of smoke was on the breeze. I stood outside my cottage, heart pounding, watching the sky to the south lit as bright as dawn, though it was well past midnight. The slaves of the nearby estates had risen and were burning the cane fields and the manor houses that had been symbols of their misery. Faintly on that hot wind, I thought I could hear shouts and the high, keening cry of a conch shell, the signal of uprising. By morning, the whole region was in chaos. Panicked planters and their families were fleeing toward Leclerc for safety, their carriages overloaded with trunks and terrified children. Thick pillars of black smoke rose in every direction, blotting out the sun by day and painting the night sky an eerie red. I saw columns of enslaved people marching down country roads, waving torches and tools turned to weapons, their faces set with grim determination and long-suppressed fury. On some plantations, the rebellion was merciless. Years of pent-up rage exploded. Some masters and overseers were killed, others ran for their lives or hid wherever they could. And where was I amid this inferno? My soul was torn. For so long I had prayed for this day, the day the yoke of slavery would be thrown off. Yet, when it came, I did not immediately join the violence. I was known as a steady, thoughtful man, and now I found myself weighing my responsibilities. I had a family to protect, and I dreaded the retaliatory wrath the colonists would unleash once they regrouped. In those first days of the uprising, I moved carefully, like a man walking through a dream where each step might plunge off a cliff. The first thing I did was ensure the safety of those I loved. With Le Cap threatened and the countryside aflame, I feared a brutal war would descend on us all. Quietly, I arranged for my wife Suzanne and our children to travel to the east, to the Spanish side of the island, where it was still relatively calm. Under the guise of a work errand, I sent them with a trusted friend and a small escort of freedmen through the mountain passes into Santo Domingo, beyond the reach of the immediate violence. Kissing my wife's forehead as she departed in a mule cart at dawn, I whispered that I would find her again when it was safe. My heart squeezed painfully as I watched my little sons, eyes wide, disappear down the jungle track. But I knew I had to stay behind. There was another act I felt compelled to do, one that may sound strange for a man of the slave revolt. But it was dictated by honor and pragmatism. I sought out my former master, the manager of Breda, Monsieur Bayon de Libertat, and his family. This was the man who had granted me freedom years ago and had, in his way, treated me with some kindness, even trusting me with responsibilities on the plantation. He was no saint. He still profited from slavery. But I knew him to be a more decent man than most planters. I found Bayon's family cowering in their great house as nearby estates burned. Instead of taking vengeance, I offered them help. Under my guidance, Bayon, his wife and children slipped away at first light, leaving Breda before the rebel bands arrived there. I led them on a back road toward the coast. Madame Bayon's eyes brimmed with grateful tears and confusion that I, a black man and a former slave, would risk aiding them. In truth, I did it partly from loyalty. The old ties of a benevolent servitude are hard to shake, and partly because I believed unnecessary bloodshed would only poison our cause. I put them on a small boat bound for a port where they hoped to catch a ship to the United States. Bayon clasped my hand with a sorrowful expression. "Toussaint," he said quietly, "I pray that God watches over you." I simply nodded and turned away, back toward the smoke and fury inland, my duty to the living remnants of my people not yet done. Once my loved ones and obligations were seen to, I turned fully to the revolution. There was no other choice for me, morally or emotionally. The pull of my people's struggle was irresistible as the tide. I was a free man of color, yes, but I was still black, still born a slave, and the scars of our collective suffering were my scars too. What good was my relative comfort if all around me my brothers and sisters were in chains or in flames? I couldn't stand aside. It was time to decide who I was and what side of history I would stand on. I had connections with several slave leaders through my herbal medicine practice and my travels around the North Plain. I knew of Georges Biassou, Jean-François Papillon, and others who had emerged to lead bands of rebels. By September of 1791, I made contact with Georges Biassou, who had set up a makeshift camp in the foothills, a refuge in the mangrove thickets by day, and a launching point for night raids. Slipping away from Breda under pretense, I rode out on horseback to find Biassou's rebel encampment. The journey took me along muddy tracks, through cane fields charred and smoldering, past plantation houses reduced to skeletal ruins, their tall white columns now blackened. Flocks of frightened birds flew overhead, confused by the fiery upheaval of their world. In the distance, I could still hear gunshots and the raw screams of confrontation in pockets where fighting raged. My heart pounded not with fear, but with solemn resolve. With each hoofbeat of my horse, I whispered a psalm under my breath. Domine, dirige nos, Lord, guide us. When I arrived at the rebel camp under cover of darkness, a guard almost shot me with a musket, thinking me an enemy. But I quickly hailed them in our Creole tongue and was recognized. Biassou himself came out of a tent to greet me. He was a stocky, dark-skinned man with a commanding presence and a musket slung over his shoulder. "Toussaint Breda," he said in surprise, using my surname from the plantation. "We did not know if you would join us." I remember the relief that flooded his eyes when I clasped his arm and replied, "How could I not? I am one of you. I have come to help win our freedom." That night, around a low fire hidden under the trees, I joined Biasu's band. They knew of my skills with medicine and asked me to tend the wounded. Many had gashes from blades or musket balls from skirmishes with the colonial militias. I set to work grinding herbs, making poultices, doing what I could to ease pain and stave off infection. Word spread among the rebels that Toussaint, the doctor, had joined the cause. Though I began as a medic, within days I also proved useful as a leader. I had experience organizing work crews and handling horses, and I could read and write a little French, rare skills among the rebels. I also carried myself with a calm, confident air that many found steadying in the chaos. Soon, Biasu entrusted me to lead a detachment of about 50 fighters to raid a supply caravan heading to the beleaguered city of Leclerc. It was my first action as a combat leader. I felt strangely at ease slipping through the shadows of night, with armed men following my whispered commands. We ambushed the caravan at dawn, surprising the soldiers escorting it. The clash was brief and frenzied. I remember discharging a flintlock pistol into the air, more than at any target, to startle the enemy horses. We brandished machetes and clubs, yelling with the pent-up wrath of the oppressed. The French soldiers, unnerved and outnumbered in the narrow jungle path, scattered. We seized crates of food, powder, and weapons. It was a small victory, but it buoyed our confidence. As we returned to camp, one of the young rebels grinned at me and said, "Merci, Commandant Toussaint." "Thank you, Commander Toussaint." "Commander." I had never been called that before. It sat strangely on my ears, yet felt right. I realized that in this crucible of revolution, I was becoming something new, shedding the skin of the obedient steward and revealing the rebel leader beneath. As the weeks turned into months, the uprising intensified and spread. By late 1791, tens of thousands of enslaved people had risen. The colonial government was stunned by the scale of it. They responded with brutal repression. Armed planter militias and French regular troops hunted the rebel bands, burning any villages suspected of harboring us. The once orderly plantations became battlefields. Both sides committed terrible deeds. Reprisals and counter-reprisals fed a growing fire of hatred. I tried to temper the violence where I could. I forbade needless cruelty among the troops under my command, urging discipline. We fight for liberty, not for vengeance alone, I would tell my men around the campfire as they cleaned their blades. But each time a rebel was captured and executed horrifically, some were broken on the wheel or burned alive by the colonists. It became harder to restrain the thirst for retribution among my people. By early 1792, the situation had evolved. The French colony was not isolated from the wider world. Across the ocean, the French Revolution was in full swing, and France had become a republic. The royal government in Saint-Domingue struggled to contain the revolt. So France sent commissioners with offers. They promised rights and improvements if the slaves would lay down arms. Coachman had been killed in battle by then. The French captured and beheaded him in November 1791, displaying his head on a pike in Leclerc Square to terrorize us. It did not have the effect they hoped. If anything, Coachman became a martyr, and his memory strengthened our resolve. Still, some early rebel leaders, uncertain of the future, considered negotiation. I attended a secret meeting in a ruined plantation house where leaders debated an offer from the French commissioner: amnesty and perhaps even freedom for those who would return to work in exchange for peace. I was relatively new among the high-ranking leaders, so I listened quietly at first as voices argued in the flicker of lantern light. Jean-François, one leader, seemed willing to accept a partial victory. Others, like a fierce young lieutenant named Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who had recently joined our ranks, growled that nothing short of total freedom for all would suffice. Dessalines. This was the first time I saw the man who would become as close as a brother and, in time, the avenging sword of our revolution. He was an imposing figure, taller than me, with muscles hardened by years of brutal labor and a body crisscrossed by the scars of many floggings. His face bore a permanent scowl as if etched by suffering. That night in the meeting, I remember how Dessalines stood up and let the lantern light reveal the keloid ridges on his chest and back. Will these scars accept anything less than true liberty? He thundered. We have already paid in blood. We must never return to the plantations as slaves. Never a chorus of Ayabobo, an amen of sorts, followed his words. I stood and spoke gently but firmly, adding my voice. Brothers, sisters, our cause is just. God and history watch us. We cannot settle for a half-freedom that leaves our children still bound. We must persist until every chain is broken. If we accept their honeyed words now, they will surely betray us later. There were solemn nods around the room. It was decided. No surrender. The war would go on. Facing stalemate and seeking any advantage, the rebel leadership made a strategic decision around mid-1792. We reached out to Spain for support. Spain controlled the eastern side of our island and was a rival to France. The Spanish colonial authorities in Saint-Domingue had quietly begun supplying arms and aid to the slave insurgents, hoping to weaken the French and perhaps annex the prosperous colony for themselves. They promised that if we helped them defeat the French planters, Spain would grant us freedom and maybe even land. To many of us who had little more than machetes and captured muskets, the offer of guns and allies seemed a godsend. So we aligned ourselves, for the time being, with the Spanish monarchy against the French Republic that still had not officially freed the slaves. I formally entered the service of Spain in early 1793, along with Biassou, Jean-François, and others. The Spanish gave me and a few of our leaders military titles. I was made a colonel in their militia. They supplied us with powder, shot, and better muskets. And in return we engaged French Republican forces across the border and in the north. It was a curious turn of fate. I, who had read Enlightenment philosophers and initially cheered the French Revolution's ideals, now found myself allied with the Catholic King of Spain. Because France, for all its talk of liberty, equality, fraternity, had not extended those ideals to people like us. France's revolution had inspired us, yes, but it had also betrayed its own principles by hesitating on slavery. So we fought the French troops when we encountered them, not out of love for Spain, but as a means to our own higher end, freedom. Under the Spanish flag, I commanded larger forces now. They gave me a uniform, heavy and hot in the tropic climate, but I wore it when required, along with a plumed hat. My men took to calling me not Toussaint Breda anymore, but Toussaint Louverture, a name I adopted around this time. Louverture means the opening in French. Some say I earned that name because I was skilled at finding the opening in battle, the weak spot in the enemy lines, or the moment to strike. Others say it symbolized how I opened the way for my people's liberty. I rather liked the double meaning. Louverture, an opening, a beginning. It felt right, as though I had stepped through a door that destiny opened for me, transforming from a plantation steward into a liberator. Throughout 1793, the war raged three-sided. Slaves turned rebels and their new Spanish allies against the French colonial authorities, while the British from nearby Jamaica also opportunistically invaded parts of the colony. Saint-Domingue became a theater of shifting allegiances and nightmares. I led my troops, now a few thousand strong, in numerous engagements. Villages changed hands multiple times. One week we might seize a town from the French, and the next week British ships would bombard the coast and land red-coated soldiers, forcing everyone into temporary truces or different alignments. In the midst of such confusion, I strove to keep my eye on the true prize. I drilled my soldiers rigorously, instilling discipline. We were no longer merely scrabbling bands. I forged them into something like a real army. I trained them in European military tactics and also in guerrilla warfare. Ambushes in the night, swift attacks then disappearing into the mountains. We became highly effective at harassing the enemy, whether French or even British troops, and then melting away before a counterattack. And yet, for all these battles, true freedom still hung in the balance. The majority of our people were still technically enslaved in the eyes of the law, except when they stood under the Spanish banner with us. But then, a miraculous change of fortune arrived from across the sea. In early 1794, word came that in Paris, the French National Convention had finally abolished slavery in all French territories. This was astonishing, joyous news, almost too good to believe at first. Rumors reached us that a decree had been passed proclaiming all slaves in the colonies free citizens of France. The reason was partly pragmatic. The French Republic was at war with Spain and Britain, and they realized they could only save the colony by winning the loyalty of the black insurgents. Whatever the reason, the effect was revolutionary and immediate. I recall the day the official proclamation arrived in our camp. A courier under a flag of truce rode up from the French lines, carrying a tricolor cockade and papers stamped with the seal of the Republic. I met him at the edge of a cane field that was charred from recent fighting. He handed me a written copy of the decree. My French was rudimentary, but I could read enough. My eyes blurred with tears as I scanned the words. Slavery was abolished. All men, regardless of color, were declared free and equal under the law. France, the same nation whose soldiers I had been fighting, had finally acknowledged our humanity. For a long moment I could not speak. Dessalines, who stood beside me, impatiently asked, "What does it say, Toussaint?" I found my voice, and with it a great whoop of joy erupted from deep in my chest. "It says we are free," I cried. "It is done. The law has freed us." Those gathered around me, battle-hardened warriors, looked stunned. Then one by one they started smiling, then laughing, then embracing one another. Some fell to their knees, sobbing openly, overcome by emotion. I removed my Spanish military hat with its gaudy feather and tossed it aside. We lit bonfires that night, not of destruction, but of celebration. Under the starry sky, we sang both Vodou hymns of thanksgiving and, tentatively, the revolutionary French anthem, the Marseillaise, with its lines of triumph over tyranny. We were no longer rebels against France if France had freed us. Now, truly, we could be part of that grand ideal of liberty. Of course, I was not naive. I knew proclamations on paper would not instantly erase the entrenched forces still loyal to slavery. Many planters in remote areas had not accepted the decree and clung to their power. The British and Spanish still occupied parts of the colony, intending to uphold slavery if they won. But France's moral capitulation on slavery changed everything. It meant I could now align my cause with a larger official cause, the noble ideals of the French Republic, rather than serve a foreign crown. I made a fateful choice then. With clarity in my heart, I decided to switch allegiance to the French Republic, since it now represented freedom, and to use that alliance to drive out those who would enslave us again. It was not an easy announcement to make to my comrades who had been fighting the French. Around a campfire, I gathered my top officers, including Dessalines and Christophe. The firelight flickered on their faces as I explained. France has abolished slavery. The Republic offers us citizenship and equality. Spain and Britain still keep slaves. Therefore, our duty is to join with the Republic, for they have embraced what we bled for, and to defeat those who would enslave us again. There was silence. Then Dessalines spat into the fire and said bluntly, "I care not for France. I care only that our people are free." I put a hand on his shoulder. "Exactly, my friend. That is why we fight now with France. Because for the moment, France and freedom are on the same side. If that ever changes, I swear by Almighty God I will fight France too. But now, with French arms and support, we can chase the Spaniards and British out and ensure no slaver's chain ever rattles again on this land." One by one they nodded. We were pragmatic men. We had always used politics as needed for our higher ends. In May of 1794, in a formal ceremony at a French outpost, I and several of my officers came into the French lines and publicly pledged our loyalty to the Republic. A French commissioner embraced me and called me Citizen Toussaint Louverture. How sweet those words, citizen, not slave, sounded. The tricolor flag was raised, and for the first time I could cheer it sincerely, knowing it now stood for liberty. The transformation was astonishing. Overnight, foes became allies. Formerly bitter fights ceased between my forces and the French Republican troops. Now black, mulatto, and white soldiers mingled in common cause against the external enemies. I was promoted to general in the French service, given fine new uniforms, which I often neglected to wear in the field, preferring my plain clothes, and a simple red scarf around my waist that became a signature. My army, already tempered by years of guerrilla war, was now bolstered by supplies and artillery from French arsenals. In the aftermath of Emancipation, I rode through the plains that had been battlegrounds and saw something like hope begin to blossom amid the ashes. On one plantation, I encountered a group of formerly enslaved families who had cautiously returned to plant provisions in their old gardens, believing the war might be ending for them. I dismounted and spoke to them as gently as I could, confirming they were indeed free now by law. An old woman, who had once been forced to cut cane from dawn to dusk, knelt at my feet and wept, clutching my hand and calling me Bon Papa Toussaint, good Father Toussaint. Embarrassed and moved, I lifted her up and said, "No, Maman. Thank God and the brave people who fought. There is still much to do," but she only smiled a toothless smile and said, "Bon dit bon. God is good." For that moment, in that simple garden under the hot Caribbean sun, I felt truly at peace. The long night of slavery was, at least in principle, over. We had pierced through it as the first light of a new dawn for our people. Little did I know, our struggles were far from finished. New wars and betrayals awaited. But that moment, when I held the Emancipation decree in my hand, and when our people first felt the winds of liberty blowing, lives in my memory as one of the purest joys of my life. The seed planted at Bois Caïman had broken through the earth and was reaching for the sky. I silently thanked the spirits and the Lord for guiding us this far. And I steeled myself for the next phase, securing and defending that freedom against all who would challenge it. With the enslaved legally free and my forces now allied with the French Republic, a new chapter unfolded for Saint-Domingue. I threw myself into the work of securing that hard-won freedom. The years from 1794 onward were a whirlwind of battles and rebuilding. The foreign enemies still on our soil had to be expelled, and the colony, devastated by years of war, needed peace and production to thrive again. I wore many hats in those days: general on the battlefield, statesman at the negotiating table, and administrator guiding the daily toils of a society in transition. Often, I scarcely slept more than a few hours a night. Yet I felt propelled by an inner fire. Perhaps it was the prayers of those still hopeful, or the spirits of our ancestors urging me on. Together with the French Republican troops, now our comrades, we turned against our former allies, the Spanish. By 1795, Spain, exhausted by the wider war in Europe, signed the Treaty of Basel, ceding the eastern half of Hispaniola, Santo Domingo, to France, and effectively withdrawing. Before the treaty was even finalized, I led my forces in capturing several towns on the Spanish side, liberating the slaves there as well. When news of the peace came, the Spanish soldiers departed, leaving the entire island nominally under French control and under the protection of our Black Army. I remember riding into the old Spanish capital, Santo Domingo, in a formal ceremony after the treaty. The remaining populace, Spanish colonials and mixed communities, watched curiously as I, a black general in French uniform atop a magnificent black stallion, proclaimed that slavery was abolished in Santo Domingo, just as in Saint-Domingue. We tore open the doors of the slave market there, one of the oldest in the Americas, and let the last slaves walk free. The echoes of their rejoicing prayers in Spanish and African tongues followed me as I rode on. In my heart, I gave thanks. One more chain had fallen. The British, however, were a more stubborn foe. They had seized nearly all of Saint-Domingue's coastal cities in the south and west during 1793 to 94, hoping to take advantage of the chaos and perhaps snatch the colony for themselves. Now they held out, fortified by their navy's support. For several years, fighting the British was like trying to uproot a deeply embedded thorn. They controlled ports like Mole Saint-Nicolas and parts of the rich Artibonite region. But they underestimated our resolve and the unforgiving climate. Yellow fever, the dreaded fever of the tropics, became our silent ally, decimating British regiments unused to the Caribbean. We harassed their outposts relentlessly. I orchestrated a campaign of attrition, cutting off their supply lines, attacking at dusk or dawn when their guards were weary, then disappearing into the hills. The local people, now largely supportive of us since Emancipation, refused to collaborate with the British. Instead, they provided my fighters with food, shelter, and information. By 1798, the British expedition was battered and weary. I received envoys from the British commander, General Maitland, seeking an honorable withdrawal. In secret parleys under flags of truce, we negotiated a deal. The British would evacuate entirely, and I guaranteed their safe passage and promised not to invade the nearby British colony of Jamaica or foment slave rebellion there. It was a difficult thing to shake hands with our former enemy, but a necessary one. And so the British left, their warships setting sail one by one out of Saint-Domingue's harbors, their ambitions defeated. As the last British ship's sails vanished over the horizon, a cheer went up from our ranks. We had cleared the land of foreign oppressors at last. Only the French flag, now the flag of liberty, flew over the island, and beneath it stood black, mulatto, and white citizens, all ostensibly equal. With external threats diminished, I turned to internal matters. Though France still claimed the colony, in practice I was the highest authority in Saint-Domingue. By 1796, I had been appointed lieutenant governor and then commander-in-chief of all French forces here. The French officials who remained, like Governor Laveau and Commissioner Sonthonax, the one who had first declared abolition in 1793, eventually left or were maneuvered out by me as I consolidated leadership. I respected France, but I trusted local knowledge and my own judgment more when it came to governing my people. Perhaps some in Paris already viewed me with suspicion for acting too independently. But until I had reason to break away, I maintained the facade of faithful allegiance. One complexity was the relationship between black Haitians, formerly enslaved, and the free people of color, especially those of mixed race, the mulattoes. Before the Revolution, the mulatto community had been a class apart. Many were educated landowners, some even slave owners themselves, chafing under French discrimination but not eager to see slave uprisings. During the upheaval, a prominent mulatto leader, André Rigaud, had established control over the southern provinces. For a time, we maintained an uneasy alliance, focusing on common enemies. But once the British were gone, old tensions resurfaced. Rigaud was fiercely proud and resentful of any authority over him, especially from a black leader like myself. When a French agent named Eduville tried to sow discord between us in 1799, civil war erupted. A heartbreaking turn of events in a revolution that should have united all the oppressed. Thus began what some call the War of Knives, a violent struggle between my forces and Rigaud's in 1799 to 1800. It was as if a family quarreled with knives drawn, hence the name. I tried initially to negotiate, to urge unity, but mistrust ran too deep. Rigaud and his followers in the South feared domination by the more numerous black ex-slaves of the North, and resented that I had become the face of the revolution. In turn, many black soldiers distrusted the mulatto officers, recalling how some had aligned with the old slave system against the slave uprising. The conflict was bitter. My best lieutenant in that campaign was Dessalines, fiery, relentless Dessalines. I dispatched him to sweep through the southern peninsula and put down Rigaud's rebellion. And sweep he did, like a hurricane. Town after town fell to our army. Dessalines, scarred by slavery and battles, showed little mercy. Some atrocities occurred that even I winced to hear of. Prisoners executed, villages burned as punishment for resistance. I would later try to mend the rift. But the scars between black and mulatto communities would not heal easily after that fratricidal bloodshed. By the summer of 1800, Rigaud was defeated and fled into exile. The entire colony now answered to me. For the first time, all of Hispaniola, from the furthest western cape to the easternmost Spanish-speaking towns, was under a single administration, with a black governor-general at its helm. The magnitude of that struck me one quiet evening as I rode alone to the top of a hill overlooking the rich plain of the Artibonite Valley. It was just before sunset. Golden light spilled over endless fields of cane and plantain, over hamlets where people were finishing their day's work, not as slaves, but as free laborers. Smoke from cooking fires rose straight into the calm dusk sky. I thought of the generations before me, who had known nothing but bondage. Now, here I stood, a son of those enslaved, holding the reins of the land they once tilled under the lash. Emotion overcame me. I dismounted and knelt in the high grass, bowing my head. Perhaps it looked as though I prayed. And indeed I did whisper gratitude to God and to the ancestors. I felt their presence strongly in that moment. The souls of those who died unknown in the cane fields, those who leapt from slave ships into the sea, those who kept alive the ember of African pride through the long dark night. We have done it, I murmured. We are reclaiming this island in your names. A warm breeze stirred the grass as if in answer. But freedom's blessings brought new challenges. With the war essentially over by 1801, our people needed livelihoods and stability. The plantations lay mostly in ruins or abandoned. The economy that had made the colony the pearl of the Antilles was shattered. Some thought that was fine. Let the hated sugar plantation system die. Many ex-slaves imagined they would each get a small piece of land to farm for themselves, living independently on their own provision grounds. It was an enticing dream. After all, to work for oneself on one's own soil is a kind of true freedom. Yet I had grave concerns. I knew the world was watching this first society of free blacks and expecting us to fail. I knew that if we did not revive the production of export crops like sugar and coffee, France or other powers might seize any excuse to intervene and re-enslave us, claiming we were incapable of sustaining a civilization. And practically, the colony's wealth was tied to those crops. Without them, we could not trade for arms, tools, or other necessities to defend and build our new nation. So, I made a painful decision. I enforced a system of paid plantation work. I decreed that laborers should return to the fields, working for wages under their old overseers or planters, who were now in theory employers rather than masters. The land largely remained organized in big estates, not parceled out into small farms. I hoped to show that the plantations could be just as productive with free labor as they had been under slavery, without the barbarity. We offered a share of profits to the workers, banned the whip as punishment, and allowed them Sundays and holidays for rest. But, truth be told, Many laborers still felt coerced by my policies. I required them to keep working and instituted a strict regimen akin to military discipline to prevent idleness or squatters taking over unused land. Some called it a forced freedom, and in their eyes, I, Toussaint, began to resemble the old masters in practice. It pained me deeply to hear such grumblings, but I believed I was acting for the greater good and the future security of our people. One incident still weighs on my heart. A local uprising in 1801 led by my own nephew, Moïse, who was like a son to me. Moïse objected to how strictly I was compelling former slaves to labor and obey plantation authorities again. He argued that the people had fought for liberty, not to be tied to the same lands under a new guise. He wasn't entirely wrong. But if everyone abandoned the plantations, the economy and our hard-won state might collapse, and our victory could be undone by hunger and anarchy. When Moïse's followers in the north resorted to violence against some of the overseers, I reacted swiftly to quash it, fearing it would spiral out of control and invite the French to intervene. Moïse was arrested and, despite my personal anguish, executed by firing squad as a warning that revolt against the new order would not be tolerated. The night after I ordered his execution, I could find no rest. I walked outside under a brilliant full moon, the cane leaves shimmering silver, and questioned if I had betrayed the very ideals I bled for. The sobs I shed were only witnessed by the silent fields. I prayed for forgiveness and the strength to carry the burden of leadership with wisdom and compassion. In governing, I also extended a hand of reconciliation to the whites who had once oppressed us. A gesture many of my compatriots found hard to accept. I truly bore no malice toward individuals solely for their race. I sought a society where character mattered more than color. Those white planters who had fled during the rebellion were invited to return, under the condition they accept the new order of freedom. A surprising number did, for they were financially ruined abroad and knew that I, at least, kept order and restored productivity. When they came back, they found that on their estates the workers would listen to me, Toussaint, more readily than to them. Some bristled at taking instructions from a black general, but they learned it was the only way. In time, grudging respect grew. I remember a former plantation owner, an elderly Monsieur Leclerc, who approached me after returning. "General Louverture," he said, "I hated and feared you when I fled. I thought you would burn everything we built. Instead, I returned to find my fields better tended than I left them, my manor intact, and my old servants working calmly for wages. You have done wonders. You truly are the ouverture, the opening to a new era." I nodded quietly. Part of me was pleased to earn even an enemy's admiration. Another part thought of how many of my people had died to make this new era. It was not magic or miracle. It was sacrifice and relentless toil. Internationally, we now sought to secure recognition and allies. Though still officially a French colony, we acted with considerable autonomy. I opened trade with the British and Americans, who were ironically more willing to engage now that the specter of a French-controlled Black Revolution was tempered by assurances of commerce and stability. American merchants from Philadelphia and New York sailed into our ports, exchanging tools, cloth, and arms for our sugar, coffee, and indigo. I corresponded with the President of the United States, John Adams, and later Thomas Jefferson, trying to assuage their concerns that our revolution would spread like wildfire to their own slave South. I promised I would not export revolution beyond our shores, though in my heart I hoped the light of freedom would ignite everywhere. To the British, too, I promised peaceful trade. We needed friends and supplies. We had seen how vulnerable we were to blockades during war. However, above all, I desired a stable accord with France. I considered myself a Frenchman in the sense of sharing the revolutionary values of 1789 and gratitude for the abolition decree of 1794. I hoped that the first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte, who had seized power in France, would see the merit in a prosperous, loyal Saint-Domingue led by its black citizens. I wrote letters to him, full of formal flattery and assurances of my loyalty, signing myself, your humble and obedient servant, Toussaint Louverture. In truth, I mistrusted Bonaparte. Rumors came that he spoke dismissively of a cursed race in the islands, and that his wife's family, the Bonapartes and Beauharnais, were former plantation owners eager to see slavery restored. The French Revolution's fervor had cooled, and the new regime in France seemed more interested in order and profit than ideals. But until I had reason to break away, I maintained the polite pretense of faithful allegiance. In July 1801, I took a bold step. I promulgated a new constitution for Saint-Domingue. I convened an assembly of local representatives, though I guided their hand heavily, to draft it. This constitution effectively solidified our autonomy under French sovereignty. It reaffirmed the permanent abolition of slavery. "Slavery is forever abolished," were words we carved in stone for our land. It declared all citizens of Saint-Domingue equal, and all were French in name and rights. But it also named me Governor-General for life, with the power to choose my successor, and it gave me sweeping authority to make laws. In essence, it was my way of protecting the gains of the revolution under my strong hand, lest any faction or foreign schemer unravel them. I knew some would call me a dictator for this, but I believed I was a benign one, ruling for the people's welfare. Under that constitution, Catholicism was established as the official religion, aligning with my own devout faith and to appease the Church, which I saw as a stabilizing force for morality and education. It also subtly did not explicitly say Saint-Domingue was subject to all the laws of France, an omission Bonaparte would not miss. When news of our self-written constitution reached France, Napoleon was livid. He reportedly exclaimed, "This surpasses the authority of any colonial governor. Has that rascal Toussaint crowned himself king over there?" I can imagine him slamming a fist on his map table in Paris. In truth, I had no wish to sever ties with France outright. I would have been content to remain a part of the French Empire as a semi-independent state with our freedoms guaranteed. But I also started to quietly prepare for the worst. I expanded the army, trained men rigorously, stored munitions in mountain redoubts, and even began fortifying key mountain passes. I did not announce it as preparation for war. I spoke of defense against any return of the British or against brigands. But in my soul I knew a confrontation with Bonaparte might be inevitable. Napoleon had grand designs to rebuild a French empire in the Americas. He even forced Spain to return the vast Louisiana territory to France in 1800. Saint-Domingue, the gem of the Caribbean, he would surely want under tight French control and profitable again in the old way. Late in 1801, an expedition began gathering in French ports. We heard whispers of it. Some thought it was aimed at other colonies or at reigning in Louisiana. I suspected otherwise. I received letters from a French acquaintance that alarmed me. One hinted that special laws for colonies would be applied. Code words, I feared, for the possible reintroduction of slavery. Another warned, "Beware, General. There are plans in motion to restore order in Saint-Domingue beyond what your constitution allows." By late 1801, rumors flew of a large French armada preparing to sail for our shores. I redoubled my diplomatic efforts to dissuade Bonaparte. In one letter, I wrote passionately, "Do not undo the work of the revolution in Saint-Domingue. It would be an injustice to reinstate slavery, where a whole people has fought and bled for liberty. We stand ready to defend the island against any who would enslave us anew. But we wish to remain part of France, faithful and free." I entrusted this message to my confidant, Colonel Vincent, to deliver in person to Bonaparte. Whether it reached sympathetic ears, I doubted. During this anxious period, I also tried to ease the lives of the people where I could. We reopened schools and invited teachers, including some priests and even nuns from abroad, to educate the children in basic literacy and morals. I walked the streets of Le Cap, Cap Français, rebuilt from ashes after it burned in the fighting, dressed in my uniform, greeting market women and workers, encouraging a sense of normalcy and hope. When someone bowed and called me Excellency, I would gently correct them. "Call me Papa Toussaint if you wish, for I see myself as a father to this nation." Publicly, I maintained a serene confidence, but privately, I prayed every night for guidance and protection. I felt a tightening in my chest as each week passed without clear word from France. Then, one day in late January 1802, our lookouts on the eastern cape signaled the approach of ships, many ships, on the horizon. I climbed up to an observation point on a fort's rampart by the bay and beheld a sight that made my blood run cold despite the tropical heat. Warships, their sails billowing, dozens of them emblazoned with the French tricolor, were gliding toward our harbors. It was the largest fleet any of us had ever seen in these waters. Troop carriers, frigates, gunboats. Their hulls bristled with cannons that glinted in the sunlight. The French expedition had arrived, commanded by General Charles Leclerc, Napoleon's brother-in-law, at the head of 20,000 troops, many of them battle-hardened veterans from Europe. I stood there, silent and still, as alarm bells began to ring in Le Cap below. Townsfolk rushed out to point at the invasion force drawing near. My heart pounded slowly and heavily, but I forced myself to remain outwardly calm. So, it would be war after all. Bonaparte had sent his answer to our constitution and autonomy, not in words, but in steel and gunpowder. Reports came quickly. Leclerc's forces landed at multiple points and intended to take back full control of the colony. With secret orders, we later learned to reinstate slavery once they secured victory. I thanked the messenger who brought this intelligence and dismissed him. For a few minutes, I remained alone on the rampart, watching the dark armada slowly loom larger on the waters. Seabirds wheeled and cried above the ships as if mocking our island's impending peril. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply the salt air. An image flashed in my mind, the faces of those who first sparked this revolution at Bois Caïman, the flames of the plantations, the children born free because of our struggle. I felt a rising determination cut through my fear. "They will not undo this," I whispered. "No one will make us slaves again." Taking up my spyglass, I looked once more at the formidable fleet and then inland to the green mountains behind me. Those mountains had harbored Maroons and freedom fighters for decades. They could harbor an army of free Haitians yet again. I knew the terrain would be our ally, as would the fever and climate. We had faced impossible odds before and prevailed. We would do it again, if God willed. Even so, a heaviness settled in my soul. I was no longer a young man. I was nearing 60. War is a younger man's domain, and so much blood had already been spilled. I had hoped to spend my final years guiding a peaceful nation, tending perhaps to a small farm of my own, and watching my grandchildren grow in a free land. Instead, here was another trial by fire. I steeled myself and descended from the fort. There was work to be done. Defenses to organize, messages to send to my generals across the colony. Henri Christophe in the north, Dessalines in the west, other loyal officers elsewhere. We would resist the French invasion with all our might. As I mounted my horse to ride back into the city and rally the people, I cast one last glance at the horizon, where the first French ships were beginning to drop anchor, their tricolor flags snapping smartly in the breeze. In a bitter twist of fate, the flag that had once symbolized liberty for us now heralded an army potentially bringing shackles. Yet I allowed myself a faint, grim smile of resolve. Napoleon thought he was facing a mere colonial uprising. He did not realize he was about to wage war against the very spirit of freedom itself, a spirit that had awakened in us and would not be crushed. "Let it come," I murmured, urging my horse forward. "We defeated slavery once. If need be, we shall defeat it again." And with that, I rode off to meet my destiny, whatever it would be, determined to guide my people through this gathering storm, as I had through so many before. The French invasion tested us in ways we had never been tested before. Their armada disgorged thousands of well-trained soldiers onto our shores in early 1802, and fierce battles erupted across the colony. At first, I attempted a strategy of measured resistance while still hoping for negotiation. I did not want to believe that France, now my mother country by law, truly meant to re-enslave us. So I instructed my top generals to avoid wanton destruction initially, and to see if Leclerc would uphold his proclamations of good faith. General Henri Christophe, loyal and astute, was in command at the coastal city of Cap Français when the French fleet appeared offshore. Facing overwhelming force, he feigned a willingness to parley, then made a wrenching choice. Rather than let the enemy take the city intact, Christophe set Cap Français ablaze. In an eerie nighttime scene, I watched from a nearby hillside as orange flames leaped high from the roofs of that beautiful city, once the Paris of the Antilles, turning the midnight sky blood red. The roar of the conflagration and the crash of collapsing timbers echoed for miles. Christophe, tears in his eyes, evacuated our people and torched mansions and warehouses alike. It was a harsh tactic, but we knew the French intended to use the city as a base against us. Better it be ashes than our tomb. Leclerc's forces thus landed amidst smoking ruins and an empty prize. They were furious and retaliated by executing some Haitians they captured. War had begun in earnest. Dessalines engaged the French in the west with characteristic ferocity, ambushing columns in the dense sugar fields and mangrove swamps. Meanwhile, I took to the mountains with a corps of my loyal troops, adopting guerrilla tactics that had served us so well in previous struggles. We struck French outposts at night, cut off their supply lines by day, and vanished into the forests like phantoms. One of the fiercest confrontations occurred at Fort Crête-à-Pierrot, a fort in the Artibonite Valley where Dessalines and about 1,000 of our best fighters holed up. The French besieged it with several thousand troops and heavy cannon. For weeks in March 1802, the tricolor and our makeshift battle flags contested those ramparts. The sun beat down, bodies fell on both sides. Our men inside endured hunger and thirst. They even resorted to eating their own horses and boiling leather straps to survive. But their spirit did not break. In one dawn assault, French soldiers swarmed the fort's walls expecting easy victory, only to be shocked as Dessalines himself led a bayonet charge out of the gates, howling like a warrior possessed. Our fighters, some even wielding swords or spears, clashed with the French in bloody hand-to-hand combat. It was said Dessalines fought with the strength of Ogun that day, the Vodou spirit of war, and the French were repelled, astonished at our resolve. Eventually, low on munitions and with French reinforcements closing in, Dessalines and his men executed a daring breakout through enemy lines at night, singing quietly an old warrior song as they slipped away. By the time the French stormed the fort the next morning, they found only empty ramparts, a few of our dead whom we couldn't carry, and not a single living rebel to capture. Crête-à-Pierrot became legend, proof that Haitians would rather fight to the last than surrender their liberty. Yet, for all our gallantry, the war was grinding us down. We lacked enough powder and shot to sustain a long campaign against such a formidable force. The French controlled the ports, and more enemy reinforcements arrived with each ship convoy. My own situation grew precarious. Several of my top lieutenants, persuaded by French promises or exhausted by war, began to defect or negotiate terms. Even my beloved nephew Isaac and my adopted son Placide, who had been in France and returned with the expedition as a kind of hostages, urged me to find a peaceable solution. They believed Leclerc's assurances that France would not restore slavery, that they only sought to reassert political control. By May 1802, with thousands of our people dead or dying, and the rainy season bringing disease upon all, I made a fateful decision. I agreed to lay down arms in exchange for a general amnesty and a guarantee from Leclerc that our freedom would be respected. The French, weary of the guerrilla struggle and ravaged by yellow fever, were eager to neutralize me diplomatically. We met, General Leclerc and I, at a plantation house outside Cap Français. It was a strange feeling. I arrived in full-dress uniform, riding a fine horse, to meet the brother-in-law of Napoleon, who had come to subdue us. Leclerc was polite, even warm. He treated me with a respect that I suspect was a veneer over caution. We dined and talked as if we were old comrades. "France needs your genius to restore prosperity here, General Louverture," he flattered me. "You and your officers will keep your ranks in the French army, of course. All we desire is the unity of this colony with the motherland again." I chose to believe him. Or perhaps I convinced myself I had no other choice. Too many lives hung in the balance. I thought, if I can govern under nominal French authority and keep our people free and at peace, that might be better than endless war. I knew well Napoleon despised me, but Leclerc swore up and down he had full authority to uphold emancipation. And so, a formal peace was reached. I would retire quietly to my farm at Ennery with my family and cease all resistance, while my officers integrated into the colonial army under Leclerc's command. The day I informed my troops of the accord, there was a palpable mix of relief and doubt on their faces. Some older ones, eyes full of worry, asked, "Capitaine, can we trust the French?" I answered as honestly as I could, "They have given their word, and for now we must sheathe our swords and see." In my heart, doubts churned like dark waters, but I put on a brave face. I told myself perhaps I could be like Cincinnatus, the Roman who saved his people and then retired to his plow. Perhaps the colony truly could know peace now, and our freedom would be protected by law if not by arms. For a brief moment, it seemed almost possible. I spent a few tranquil weeks at my plantation with my wife Suzanne and our children around me. How sweet it was to do simple things again. Walking at dawn through the banana groves, feeling the dewy grass under my feet. Teaching my little son to ride a mule. Reading scripture in the evenings by lamplight while crickets sang outside. French officers even paid visits, all courtesy and smiles, to ensure I was comfortable in my retirement. I extended hospitality, though I watched their eyes for any hint of deceit. It was not long before the mask dropped. In June 1802, I received a friendly letter from a French general, Jean-Baptiste Brunet, inviting me to meet him at a place called Côte-à-Bateau, ostensibly to discuss a plot of land some of my former soldiers were squabbling over. The tone was warm. He called me a sincere friend, and he implied Leclerc wanted my advice on governance. A small alarm bell rang in my mind. Why would such a minor matter require my personal attention? And why had Leclerc himself not communicated directly? My wife urged me to be cautious, sensing danger in the air. So I set out with a modest escort to meet General Brunet, prepared for either counsel or treachery. The rendezvous point was a house at the foot of a mountain, surrounded by dense tropical greenery. I arrived in the afternoon. The sun was blazing and a chorus of cicadas whirred from the trees. Brunet greeted me on the veranda with effusive pleasantries. Inside, he had a table set with chilled wine, a rare treat in that climate. We talked for a short while about trivial matters. I kept waiting for him to mention the land dispute or any substantive issue, but he danced around it. My instincts prickled. I noticed Brunet's hands were trembling slightly as he lifted his glass, and then I noticed the heavy footfall of soldiers' boots on the porch behind me. Before I could react, armed French grenadiers rushed in from every door. Brunet's expression changed from forced geniality to visible shame as he stepped back. My aides reached for their weapons, but were quickly overpowered. In seconds, I found myself surrounded by leveled bayonets. One of my generals who had accompanied me died on the spot trying to defend me, run through by a bayonet. I shouted for calm, saying, "I am here as a guest under truce." What is the meaning of this? The soldiers grabbed my arms and began to bind them with rope far too tightly. Brunet mumbled something about orders and how he was truly sorry. I will never forget the look in his eyes, a mixture of embarrassment and fear, as if he were afraid I would curse him or that God himself would strike him for betraying a man who came in peace. They marched me out of the house, disarmed and tied like a common criminal. Outside, dusk was falling. The sky to the west was a gorgeous palette of orange and purple, a last beautiful sunset in Haiti that I would ever see with my own eyes. They shoved me onto a waiting carriage and we sped off, escorted by cavalry. As we passed through a village, some of the local people realized what was happening and cried out in dismay. I sat as upright as I could, refusing to show any sign of weakness. But inside my heart was breaking. They had done it. The French had betrayed their word utterly, and I, perhaps foolish in my trust, had walked right into it. My thoughts raced. What would become of my family? What would become of the island now that I, one of the main obstacles to re-enslavement, was removed? I feared desperately for my people. At the port of Gonaïves, they transferred me to a ship named the Creole, waiting at harbor. Under cover of darkness, I was rowed out and brought aboard. The captain looked at me with a curious mixture of respect and pity. He knew who I was. They confined me to a small cabin. I peered through the porthole at the silhouette of the mountains against the starry sky. My beloved mountains of home. How many nights I had spent under those stars fighting for freedom. A lump rose in my throat. As the ship weighed anchor and began to glide away, I whispered a farewell. Au revoir, Ayiti. We shall meet again in God's time. Salt of the sea air mixed with the taste of tears on my lips, though I would not let the French see me weep. We sailed for weeks across the Atlantic. They kept me under guard, though I did not resist or cause trouble. One officer, perhaps out of sympathy, allowed me on deck at night for fresh air, under heavy watch. I would stand there, shackled, gazing at the moonlit waves. It was strangely peaceful, the open sea, the endless sky. At times I could almost forget my predicament and imagine I was simply on a voyage of discovery. But then the clank of my chains would remind me. Often I closed my eyes and cast my mind back to the shores of Haiti. I prayed for the safety of Suzanne and our children. By then, I knew Leclerc had deceitfully captured my wife and sons as well, though they were treated less harshly and would later be released. My greatest torment was not knowing what would happen to my people in my absence. I had planted a tree of liberty. Would it be felled now that I, its main gardener, was gone? In France, they sent me far north to a fortress prison high in the Alps, the Fort de Joux. Oh, what a cruel irony of fate. From the warm, sun-kissed cane fields of the Caribbean to a cold stone dungeon in a wintry mountain, when I arrived in late summer of 1802. The air even then was chilly. The fortress was old, damp, and smelled of mold and despair. They placed me in a small cell with a single tiny window, through which I could see a patch of sky and distant pine-covered slopes. Snow capped the peaks even in September. The prison regime was severe. Despite my rank and the diplomatic treachery that brought me there, they treated me as they would any common prisoner. My jailers, likely acting on orders from Paris, allowed me little comfort. Firewood was rationed stingily, so my cell was perpetually cold. I had only the clothes I arrived in, and soon they became ragged. I requested additional blankets. The warden scoffed that I should be strong enough to handle a little chill. The food was sparse and coarse. Hard bread, thin soup, and often I could not keep it down, as my stomach had been upset by stress and the abrupt climate change. Before long, I fell ill with fevers and aches. They brought a doctor once, who bled me, a common European practice that only left me weaker. During those lonely months, I occupied myself by writing and reflection. They allowed me pen and paper for a time, until even that was taken away when Bonaparte's ministers worried I might smuggle out politically damaging statements. I managed to write a few letters and the beginnings of a memoir. In one report to the French government, I penned these words, heavy with indignation. I have served France with honor. Why am I treated with cruelty and denied basic necessities? Without a doubt, I owe this treatment to my color. For indeed, I came to realize that was at the heart of it. They could not bear that a black man had humbled the armies of Europe and governed a land as an equal. Perhaps Napoleon feared me as a symbol that could inspire others. So he meant to erase me, quietly, in this frozen oubliette. The winter of 1802 to 1803 was merciless. Snow piled in drifts against the fortress walls. I huddled by a small brazier of coals that was barely warm, my breath visible each morning as a puff of vapor. My health deteriorated rapidly. I lost weight. My legs swelled painfully. I was racked by coughing fits that left streaks of blood on my kerchief. There were nights I shook with chills so violently I feared I'd simply stop breathing. I appealed to the guards for a doctor, or at least more heat. But some sneered that I was faking illness to gain leniency. One even taunted, "The African sun not so hot here, eh?" Perhaps now you think twice about making war on white men. I said nothing in return, conserving my strength. Often in those dark, endless nights, I drifted into feverish dreams. I saw the faces of those I loved, my wife, my children, my comrades. I heard the songs of Haiti, the Vodou chants, the crackling of a bonfire, the distant beat of drums, as if they emanated from the very stones of my cell to comfort me. In lucid moments, I told myself that even if I perished in this place, our cause would live on. I remembered what I had said when captured. Accounts differ, but in my heart I knew it true. In overthrowing me, the French have cut down only the trunk of the tree of liberty in Saint-Domingue. It will spring up again from the roots, for they are many and deep. I clung to that vision, that others would carry on the fight and that Haiti would not return to bondage. Day by day, I felt life slipping. My hands, once steady in battle, now trembled and were as thin as twigs. My eyesight dimmed. I labored to write a final letter to my wife and sons, expressing my love and urging them to keep faith. Whether it reached them, I do not know. By April of 1803, I could no longer rise from the crude stool in my cell. The end was near. I sensed it with calm acceptance. On the night of April 6th, as an icy rain lashed the fort's walls, I made my peace with God. I confessed my sins and shortcomings in a soft prayer and asked forgiveness for any whom I had hurt in the tumult of my life. Then I prayed for Haiti, that beautiful word I had embraced, though it was not yet officially our nation's name. I prayed for the deliverance of my people and for the success of Dessalines and the others who remained in the fight. I asked the Lord to watch over Suzanne and our children. A strange tranquility came over me then. The pain in my body dulled. A warmth, almost like the gentle sun of my homeland, filled my chest. In my mind, I saw one more vision. I was standing in the green cane fields of Breda as a young man, the morning dew wet on my feet. The rising sun painted the eastern sky pink and gold. From the slave quarters, I heard a familiar melody, the voice of old Nana singing a slow, hopeful tune as she cooked the meager breakfast for the workers. The scent of roasting coffee mingled with the sweet smell of ripe mangoes. I breathed in deeply. There was no anger or fear in this vision, only an overwhelming sense of belonging and love. The first light of dawn filtered through the high window of my cell. With great effort, I raised myself from the cot and sat upright. "It is finished," I whispered, though whether I meant my suffering or something greater I could not say. I felt the presence of unseen friends around me. Perhaps the spirits come to guide me onward. There was Makandal, grinning with one arm raised in salute. Coachman, solemn and proud. My father, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. Even little Moise, my nephew, smiling in forgiveness for how we had parted. I shed tears then, but they were oddly joyful. On April 7th, 1803, as the sun climbed over the snow-laced Joux mountains, I closed my eyes and let out my final breath. There, alone in a prison far from the warm island of my birth, ended the life of Toussaint Louverture. My body slumped gently, freed at last from mortal ache. The guards found me a little while later, still and peaceful, a faint smile upon my lips. They reportedly rummaged through my cell for any last writings, and then covered me with a coarse sheet. So passed from the world the one they had called the Black Napoleon, the governor of Saint-Domingue, the old coachman from Breda who dared to dream of freedom. Yet death was not the end of my story. For I knew, even as darkness enveloped me, that the flame I carried would continue to burn in Haiti. My last thoughts were of the rising tree of liberty, ready to burst forth anew from its deep, living roots. And as my spirit stepped beyond the threshold of this world, I felt a pull calling me homeward, across the wide ocean, back to the beloved land of mountains where destiny still unfolded. I did not witness with mortal eyes the final act of our people's long struggle. But in my dreams, in the whispers that reached me even in the beyond, I saw it all. In the cold darkness of my cell in the Joux Mountains, as my life waned, my spirit flew back to the beloved island. In my fevered visions, I soared above the green peaks and valleys of Saint-Domingue, watching events unfold. Perhaps it was merely the imaginings of a dying man, or perhaps the ancestors granted me sight from beyond. Either way, what I saw filled me with both sorrow and deep satisfaction. I saw that after my capture in the summer of 1802, the fight for freedom did not die. Far from it. It flared up more fiercely than ever. My great lieutenants, those I had trained and who had followed me through so many trials, took up the mantle. Dessalines, Christophe, Clairvaux, Pétion, and others. They realized soon enough that the French had deceived us. Despite General Leclerc's initial proclamations that the liberty of the former slaves would be respected, evidence mounted that Napoleon intended to reinstate slavery. The French had already cruelly restored bondage in the colony of Guadeloupe that year, using firing squads and deportations to break the resistance there. When news of that atrocity reached Saint-Domingue, any goodwill the black population had toward Leclerc evaporated. Our people knew the trap that was being laid. Disarm the black army, lull them into submission, then rechain them. Dessalines was not one to be lulled. I almost smiled, in the otherworldly way a spirit might smile, to think of him, he who had once briefly made peace with Leclerc after my arrest, turning on a dime once he confirmed the betrayal. By late 1802, yellow fever had devastated the French ranks, even claiming Leclerc himself. The new French commander, the Vicomte de Rochambeau, was a man of monstrous cruelty. I saw in my mind's eye the horrors he unleashed. He imported fierce attack dogs from Cuba trained to hunt and tear apart black rebels, and he let them loose on innocent villagers to terrorize the population. He had boatloads of shackled black prisoners taken out to sea and drowned, cannonballs chained to their feet, dark echoes of the slave ships of old. War had become outright genocide under Rochambeau's vengeful command. But my people did not cower. Instead, they became as tigers in defense of their freedom. Dessalines, now the principal leader, matched fire with fire. Coupe tête, brûlez quai. Cut off heads, burn houses, became a grim rallying cry among some of his forces. He would not yield an inch. If the French wanted blood, he would give them blood, to ensure that not a single one remained to threaten our liberty. All throughout 1803, a brutal campaign raged. Towns and plantations that had been rebuilt were again put to the torch, this time as part of a scorched earth strategy to deny the French any foothold or supplies. The once gleaming colonial mansions that symbolized centuries of oppression finally fell into ashes for good. I saw flames on the horizon of my dreams. But these were purifying flames, cleansing the land of the last vestiges of tyranny. One scene came to me with vivid clarity. The Battle of Vertières, in November of 1803. It was the final major clash. Near Cap Français, on a rain-soaked battlefield churned to mud, Dessalines' indigenous army confronted the remnants of the French expedition. I saw Dessalines astride a horse, sword raised high, his uniform weather-stained, but his presence formidable, like an African war chief of old. Around him, thousands of black and mulatto soldiers formed ranks, their hearts steeled by years of impossible victories and unspeakable sacrifices. Many wore pieces of old French uniforms, or whatever they could scavenge, but each had a strip of blue or red cloth tied somewhere, a foretaste of the new nation's colors. The heavens opened with a drenching rain, as if the Vodou spirits of the storm rode with the natives. French cannon boomed, and cannonballs tore through plantain groves. Musket volleys cracked through the gray air. The two armies crashed against each other amid bugle calls and the rhythmic pounding of a pet-woo drum carried by a Haitian drummer somewhere in the lines, urging our warriors on. I felt my spirit there among them, lending strength. I heard a young soldier shout, "Men no lib, ato nous gumen pour Toussaint." We are free now, so let's fight for Toussaint. My chest swelled with pride and emotion to know they still invoked my name as they charged forward. The French fought with desperate bravery, but they were vastly outnumbered now, outflanked by people fighting for their very existence. Vertières was a slaughter. Amid lightning and thunder, our people overwhelmed the French lines. Rochambeau's forces retreated, battered and exhausted, into their forts and ultimately to the harbor where their ships lay. They could not withstand the wrath of an army of former slaves fighting as free men and women on their own soil. By nightfall of that day, the tricolor of France was hauled down over the forts of Cap Français. In my vision, I saw Dessalines himself enter the city on horseback the next morning. He rode through the same streets I had once walked in chains as a young coachman. Now those streets lay silent, debris-strewn, with only the cheering of liberated Haitians echoing off the walls. The remaining French, their number pitifully reduced by combat and fever, agreed to surrender and evacuate. I saw Rochambeau, humiliated, board a ship under a white flag. One by one, the last Europeans set sail, leaving our shores for good. As the final French frigate disappeared over the horizon, a great sigh seemed to rise from the land itself. The skies cleared, and a warm sun broke through clouds to kiss the ravaged but victorious island. The date was late November 1803. For the first time in over 300 years, there was not a single foreign master on the soil of Saint-Domingue. We had done what no enslaved people had ever done in recorded history, overthrown our oppressors and kept our liberty by force of arms. The impossible had become reality. A few weeks later, on January 1st, 1804, our commanders and elders gathered at the town of Gonaïves to make a momentous declaration. In the golden morning light by the sea, Dessalines stood before a gathered crowd that included generals, officers, farmers, mothers, children, the people of this new nation. Many had tears in their eyes from the enormity of the moment. Dessalines' stern face actually softened with emotion as he spoke. He raised his powerful voice so all could hear. Brothers and sisters, we have conquered. We are free today because we refused to bend or break. Hereafter, we must live independent or die. Let us proclaim to the entire world, we are forever finished with France. Never again shall a colonist or European set his foot upon this territory with the title of master or proprietor. We have paid for our liberty with blood. It is sacred and irrevocable. We renounce France forever and declare Haiti free and sovereign. We swear to die rather than live under domination again. Then, in a symbolic act that many later recounted, Dessalines took a French tricolor, blue, white, and red, the flag of a nation that had twice betrayed its own ideals, and he tore out the white stripe. The remaining blue and red cloth fluttered in his hands. These, he declared, would be our colors. The white, the color associated with the oppressor, was removed, signifying that no white masters would rule us again. A young woman, Catherine Flan, stepped forward with needle and thread and swiftly sewed the two pieces, blue and red, back together. A new flag was born, the first flag of Haiti. Yes, Haiti. That name too was claimed anew. The island had been called Saint-Domingue by Europeans, but long before Columbus, the indigenous Taino people who dwelled on this land named it Ayiti, which means land of high mountains. We resurrected that original name to honor the first inhabitants who had been wiped out by colonial cruelty. Haiti, Ayiti. The very word felt like a song, like the breeze rustling through mountain pines. It spoke of a people rooted in their land, free of the chains of foreign tongues and imposed names. When Dessalines hoisted that blue and red flag, a great cry arose from the assembly. Vive Ayiti! Vive independence! Long live Haiti! Long live independence! Men fired muskets into the air. Women ululated with joy. Children jumped and clapped. Some of the old ones who had been born in Africa and survived the Middle Passage and plantation hell fell to their knees sobbing, praising God and the spirits for allowing them to see this day. I felt an indescribable joy well up in my spirit at that moment. Though I was not there in body, I was surely there in soul. Perhaps every one of our ancestors was. I imagined Makandal smiling in whatever form he now took. I imagined Coachman, the brave Hungan, standing behind Dessalines' shoulder like a proud shadow. I saw the faces of the martyred. Those whose lives were taken in mass graves, those who died of heartbreak in the slave ships, those who were whipped to death in the fields. All those departed souls seemed to hover like a luminous cloud of witnesses, rejoicing. Dessalines declared himself leader of the new nation. Later he would be crowned Emperor Jacques I in a move to ensure unity and deter foreign meddling. But titles mattered little to me now. What mattered was that the people, my people, were free and sovereign at last. In the days that followed independence, life slowly began anew under freedom's sun. The guns fell silent. The fields, long neglected during war, were tilled again, this time by free hands for fair wages or by small holders on their own plots. Town markets buzzed back to life. Fishermen cast their nets in peace in the sparkling bays. Families that had been sundered by sale or by war reunited. There were, of course, kinks and quarrels. Building a new nation is never without difficulties. But now decisions were in our own hands. Laws were made by our own leaders, reflecting our own interests. We had swapped the whips of French planters for the rule of our own chosen chiefs. There were still scars on the land and in hearts from the long nightmare of slavery and the brutal birth of liberty. But each day of simple freedom was like a balm upon those scars. At night, in villages from the shores of Jacmel to the hilltops of Jérémie, one could hear the soft sounds of drums and singing. Not secret, fearful gatherings, as in the days of bondage, but open celebrations. Under starry skies, elders poured libations of rum to the earth, thanking the Almighty and the Loa for deliverance. In the churches on Sundays, the Te Deum was sung with fervor. Voices of former slaves and even some former masters mingling in praise of the God who led Israel out of Egypt. A story so close to our own. I like to think that in those first months of freedom, someone, somewhere on a quiet evening, spoke aloud a word for me. Perhaps in a palm-thatched chapel lit by lanterns, a priest said a prayer for the soul of Toussaint Louverture, the one who opened the way. Or around a cooking fire, a grandmother told her grandchildren of the great man who had fought for their freedom and died in an icy prison so far away. I do believe my name lived on in the hearts of my people, not for my glory, but as part of the larger tale of how Haiti came to be. Now, from beyond, I rest and I watch. The island I loved, Haiti, stands independent as I always dreamed. Its mountains are as green as ever, its waterfalls tumble in pure cascades, its dawns break in gold and rose over the lush plains. The people walk with heads held high. They speak the language of their ancestors blended with that of their colonizers, Haitian Creole, a tongue uniquely their own. They dance the yanvalou and sing the old songs without fear. Children born after 1804 know of slavery only as history, a terrible story from long ago told by their elders, like a bad dream that is safely over. Haiti will face many trials in the years to come. New challenges always arise. But the spirit of 1804, the spirit of courage, unity, and love of liberty, lives on indelibly in its soul. It is a spirit I carry with me even in death, for I am part of it, and it is part of me. The night is deep now and peaceful. Over the hills of my beloved country, the tropical breeze carries the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of gentle surf. The same stars I gazed at as a boy on the Breda plantation now shine down on a free people. I drift through the warm air, a silent witness, perhaps a guardian, if I may, watching over Haiti as she sleeps. In the rustling of the palm fronds and the chirp of crickets, I hear a lullaby of freedom, the soft song of a people who claimed their own destiny. My story, and the story of the revolution we forged, is not a tale of unbroken triumph. It is filled with sorrows, sacrifices, and bittersweet victories. Yet, as the island rests under the velvet sky, I feel a profound peace. We have done what we set out to do. We turned the world upside down and made the masters tremble. We showed that the yearning of the enslaved for freedom was stronger than any chain, holier than any law of those who would keep humans in bondage. As the first light of dawn approaches, coloring the horizon with the faintest glow, I take my leave. I whisper a final prayer over the land. May you live in peace, my people. Guard well this precious freedom. Pass it like a torch through the generations, never letting it be extinguished. The prayer mingles with the sigh of the wind through the sugarcane fields that now belong to those who work them. And so, gently, the long night of our struggle fades. The dark sky lightens to a hopeful blue, the same blue of our new flag. Morning birds begin to sing sweetly from the trees. A new day dawns in Haiti, bright and free. And I, Toussaint Louverture, content in the fulfillment of all we dared to dream, finally slip into a soft and welcome sleep, my spirit at rest, a free man, forevermore, in a free land. And so, from the ashes of bondage, a nation was born. The voices once silenced by fear now sang under the turquoise skies of freedom. Toussaint, Dessalines, and countless others. Their names became echoes in the heartbeat of history. Haiti rose not just from rebellion, but from the dream that every soul deserves the right to breathe, to love, to live free. If you are still awake, tell me, which part of this journey touched your heart the most? And if sleep has already found you, may you dream of light upon the ocean, and the sound of waves washing away every chain that ever bound a human spirit.